Most people think a long life is decided by luck, by genetics, or by whatever pills a doctor eventually prescribes. But after sitting across from thousands of patients in their 70s, 80s, and even 90s, a very different pattern shows up again and again. The people who are quietly set up for a long, strong future almost never look the way you expect. They are not the ones obsessing over every supplement on the shelf. They are the ones who, without even realizing it, have been getting a handful of specific things right for years. What follows are the real signals that show up in exam rooms and on lab reports when someone in their 70s is genuinely built for longevity. Some of these will surprise you. A few of them have nothing to do with diet or exercise directly, yet they predict outcomes better than almost anything else on a chart. And by the end, you will understand why a person can look perfectly fine on the outside while quietly heading toward trouble, and why another person who seems unremarkable is actually thriving. Let's start with something buried in an ordinary blood test that almost everyone has had done at least once: the cholesterol panel. Cholesterol gets treated like a villain in most conversations, but it is actually essential. It is a building block for cell membranes, hormones, and a large part of brain tissue. The number worth paying attention to here is HDL, often called the good cholesterol, because of the job it does. HDL acts like a cleanup crew, traveling through the bloodstream, picking up excess cholesterol, and carrying it back to the liver so it can be cleared out of the body. That process is one of the reasons a high HDL is linked to a lower risk of heart disease. According to major health organizations, an HDL below 40 milligrams per deciliter in men and below 50 inches women is considered a risk factor on its own, while a level above 60 is treated as protective. Some research has found that once HDL climbs well past 80, the extra benefit seems to level off, and in certain populations, very high HDL has even been linked to different risks, so more is not always simply better. But sitting comfortably in that 50 to 70 range, or higher without going to extremes, tends to track with people who have done a lot of things right for a long time. Here's what most people don't realize about HDL. It is not just something you inherit. Yes, there is a genetic component, and some families do run higher than others, but regular movement, especially consistent walking, has a well-documented relationship with healthier HDL levels. So does swapping ultra-processed food for whole food, cutting back on refined sugar, and reducing the kind of insulin resistance that quietly builds up from years of poor eating patterns. Improving HDL isn't only about the number moving up on paper either. The quality of the particles matters, meaning how efficiently that cleanup crew actually functions, and diet plays a real role in that too. Now let's talk about something that rarely gets mentioned in a longevity conversation, and it has nothing to do with a lab value at all: a sense of purpose. This might sound soft compared to blood work and heart scans, but it shows up constantly in people who are aging well. After retirement, a lot of people lose the structure that used to organize their day, and with it, they can lose the reason to get up early and feel excited about anything. The people who continue to thrive tend to be the ones who replace that structure with something they are genuinely looking forward to. Whether that's time with grandchildren, a faith community, a hobby they finally have time for, or simply a daily walk with the dog. This is where things become really important, because purpose is not just a feel-good idea. There is a real physiological chain reaction attached to it. People with something to look forward to tend to move more. Moving more tends to improve sleep. Better sleep lowers stress hormones like cortisol. Lower cortisol supports better blood sugar control and a healthier cardiovascular system. It becomes a positive loop that reinforces itself. And it starts with something as simple as having a reason to get out of bed. Next is a test that many people have had without ever fully understanding what the numbers actually mean: the echocardiogram, essentially an ultrasound of the heart. It doesn't use radiation. It's painless, and it gives an enormous amount of information about how the heart is functioning. One of the key numbers here is ejection fraction, which measures how efficiently the heart pumps blood out with each beat. A normal ejection fraction generally falls somewhere between 55 and 70%, and that number reflects the overall strength and efficiency of the heart muscle. but ejection fraction is only part of the picture. An echocardiogram can also reveal whether the walls of the heart have thickened over time, which often happens after years of poorly controlled blood pressure. Just like a muscle that grows from repeated strain, the heart's walls can thicken under chronic pressure, and that thickening is associated with a higher future risk of heart failure. The size of the heart's upper chambers matters too. When the heart is under sustained stress, those chambers can enlarge, and that enlargement is another marker that specialists watch closely because it can signal problems well before any symptoms appear. There's also something called diastolic function, which describes how well the heart relaxes between beats, not just how hard it squeezes. A heart that is starting to stiffen and doesn't relax properly can be an early warning sign of future heart failure, even while everything else looks normal on the surface. Modern echocardiograms can also measure something called global longitudinal strain, a more detailed way of analyzing how the walls of the heart move. This measurement can sometimes catch subtle problems, including abnormal thickening or unusual protein buildup in the heart muscle, long before those problems would show up using older, simpler measurements. The surprising part is that a single echocardiogram is really just a snapshot. What tells a much richer story is comparing scans taken years apart, because that comparison shows the trajectory the heart is actually on, not just where it happens to be today. And one detail that's easy to overlook: the heart valves open and close somewhere in the range of 80 to 100,000 times a day. Finding a 70-year-old whose valves show little wear after that many decades of nonstop motion is genuinely a strong sign of durability. Now to a pair of numbers that show up on almost every basic blood panel, but rarely get much attention: total protein and albumin. Albumin in particular is one of the more powerful and underappreciated markers of long-term nutritional status. Protein is the raw material the body uses for nearly everything, from immune defense to muscle tissue to the structural proteins that make up the heart itself. When albumin starts drifting downward, especially into the lower end of the normal range or below it, that is often a sign that the body isn't getting enough protein or is breaking it down faster than it can be replaced. Many people overlook this simple detail until it becomes a real problem. A normal total protein level typically sits around 6.5 grams per deciliter or higher, and normal albumin is usually around 3.5 grams per deciliter or above. When those numbers slide into the low threes, that's a signal worth taking seriously, because low albumin is strongly associated with a condition called sarcopenia, which is the progressive loss of muscle mass that becomes more common with age. It shows up often in people recovering from long hospital stays, and it can also appear in people with advancing heart disease, where the body starts burning through muscle simply because of the ongoing physical stress placed on it. The fix here is not complicated, even if it takes consistency. Getting enough protein through the diet, staying physically active enough to actually use that protein to build and maintain muscle, and catching any drop in these numbers early rather than after real muscle loss has already occurred. This single blood marker has been linked to outcomes across a huge range of conditions, which is part of why experienced clinicians pay close attention to it even when nothing else on the chart looks alarming yet. And that's what changes everything when we come to the next sign, because it might be the simplest one on this entire list: how much a person actually walks. Walking is one of those things that sounds too basic to matter, yet the research behind it is remarkably strong. For a long time, 10,000 steps a day was treated as the gold standard, but that particular number actually came from a 1960s Japanese marketing campaign rather than rigorous science. More recent large-scale research, including a major analysis published in The Lancet Public Health, found that the biggest drop in mortality risk shows up somewhere around 7,000 to 9,000 steps a day, with meaningful benefits appearing even earlier than that. For adults over 60 specifically, some of this research suggests the curve flattens out around 6,000 to 8,000 steps, meaning you don't necessarily need to chase a huge number to get most of the benefit, Even modest amounts matter. Some studies have found real reductions in mortality risk, starting at just 2,500 to 4,000 steps a day, which is well within reach for almost anyone, regardless of age or mobility level. The point isn't to hit some arbitrary target perfectly. The point is that consistent movement, day after day, is one of the strongest predictors of healthy aging that exists in the research. Sedentary behavior, on the other hand, tends to set off a very different chain of events. Long periods of sitting are associated with insulin resistance, muscle loss, weaker bones, and a higher risk of falls. And falls in older adults are a serious concern. A hip fracture in someone over 70 can, in some cases, carry worse long-term outcomes than a major cardiac event, largely because of the prolonged immobility and complications that can follow. Walking regularly helps maintain bone density, supports core strength, and keeps the muscles that prevent falls in good working order. It is, quite simply, one of the most protective habits available to anyone at any age, and it costs nothing. Many people overlook this simple detail until it becomes a real problem. None of this means becoming a purist about food. People who age well are not usually the ones who never touch a dessert or never enjoy a plate of fries. What actually separates them is that they rarely stack two indulgent choices back to back. A rich meal one night tends to be followed by a lighter, more careful day rather than another round of the same thing. That single habit, treating an indulgence as an occasional exception rather than a daily pattern, keeps the overall average of what someone eats in a healthy range without requiring total restriction. It's a far more sustainable approach than strict all or nothing dieting, and it matches what long-term research on eating habits consistently shows. Total intake over weeks and months matters far more than any single meal. Finally, the sign that tends to carry the most weight of all: how many medications a person is actually on. This isn't a judgment against medication, because plenty of conditions genuinely require it, and stopping a necessary prescription without medical guidance can be dangerous. But when a person in their 70s, 80s, or even 90s walks in with only a couple of prescriptions, or sometimes none at all, that pattern tends to correlate strongly with a healthier overall trajectory. It usually isn't because they refused treatment when they needed it. More often, it's because consistent lifestyle habits over decades meant blood pressure, blood sugar, and cholesterol never spiraled into territory that required heavy pharmaceutical intervention in the first place. There is a well-documented phenomenon in medicine, sometimes called a prescribing cascade, where one medication causes a side effect. That side effect gets treated with a second medication, and that medication causes its own side effect, and so on. It's not uncommon to see older patients arrive at a hospital on 15, 20, or more medications, many of which exist only to manage the side effects of something else on the list. None of this means medication is bad. It means that the fewer medications someone genuinely needs, generally speaking, the better their underlying health has been managed over the long run. So what actually ties all of this together? None of these 6 signals exist in isolation. A good HDL level is often the downstream result of years of walking. A strong echocardiogram is frequently the reward for controlling blood pressure early rather than late. Healthy albumin levels depend on both eating enough protein and staying active enough to use it. Even a sense of purpose feeds back into all of it, because people who feel like they have something to live for tend to move more, sleep better, and take better care of themselves without even thinking about it as a health strategy. None of this requires perfection. Nobody eats perfectly every single day. Nobody hits every step goal, and nobody sails through life without an occasional setback in their health. What actually separates people who age well from those who struggle isn't the absence of mistakes. It's consistency in the small decisions that repeat day after day, because those small decisions compound over time, for better or worse. Skipping the extra dessert most nights, choosing a walk over another hour on the couch, staying on top of a checkup instead of avoiding it. These things add up in ways that are easy to underestimate in the moment and impossible to ignore decades later. If there is one thing worth carrying away from all of this, it's that longevity is rarely about one dramatic decision. It is built quietly, in the ordinary choices most people never think twice about, repeated consistently enough that they eventually show up as protective numbers on a lab report, a strong reading on a heart scan, or simply the ability to walk comfortably at 80 years old. That is genuinely within reach for far more people than most realize. And it starts with the next small choice in front of you, not some perfect plan for tomorrow.